So here we go. Why does Kanban hit us great?
Yes, yes. A subtitle and explanation of 80% of LinkedIn arguments about Agile. What I want to do to start out with is to talk about who we are, meaning both me and you folks. The intent is, when I give this talk or a talk similar to this, a lot of times is at conferences where people have to make decisions about where they're going to go. And so I like for people to know in the first few minutes if this talk is for them or not. So if it's not, they can just kind of gracefully slip out the back and go to something more interesting. In this particular case, I'm not exactly sure where you're going to go. I guess if you prefer nothing to this talk, you might slip out. But this at least is a decent summary of what I want to cover in this talk. Generally, if you're aware that there's some kind of tension between Scrum camps and Kanban camps, and you just wonder what all the hubbub is about, if you're familiar with one but not necessarily the other, and you're Kanban curious maybe, or you're wondering which is better for you, and or if they can be used together. And this is more or less an outline of this talk. Why are these things different? Why is there a tension? How does one get things done that the other doesn't? How do you make decisions about which one you want to use? And are there roads that you can take that bring them together, actually? Here's a little bit about me. I am Phil Ledgerwood. I'm the owner of Integrity Inspired Solutions, which is a custom software development company right in the middle of the United States of America. So if you look at a map of the USA and you put your finger right in the center of it, the odds are pretty good you've got where we are. We are in Kansas City. I'm also a coder. I'm a developer, so I approach these issues not primarily from a professional coach perspective, as you'll find out right away, but from a developer's perspective a lot of times. However, in my capacity at Integrity, I also have to act in the role as project manager on several projects and product manager in several projects. And probably most of the work I do these days is mostly with project managers or people in a roughly analogous role. I also do our company's Agile coaching. It's not the main service that we offer, but I really enjoy it, so we do it. I'm a certified Scrum Master and a certified Pro Kanban trainer, so I am familiar with both. I have used both in practice many, many times over the years, and so I just like to throw that out there just because I want to make it clear that I'm not a huge fan of one and I know very little about the other. I am fairly familiar with both. And also I'm on LinkedIn getting into arguments all the time. If you enjoy that thing, there's my profile for that. I'll have a little slide with my contact info at the end. I do want to say a quick word about my biases in this topic. Wouldn't it be great if everybody who told you something told you up front what their biases were, like the news or things like that. I do want to say that I have used Kanban almost exclusively on my company's projects for the past several years. It is a much better fit for us than Scrum has been. And I don't dislike Scrum. I think Scrum is very valuable in many situations. So I don't want you to feel like I'm negative about Scrum. At the same time, I'm a very big advocate of Kanban, and I'm very passionate about it. And so if you hear me talk about something and you feel like maybe I'm showing some favoritism to Kanban, you are probably accurate. So I just wanted to warn you about that up front. So as you're listening to what I say, obviously you'll want to check it out against other perspectives, which may differ from mine as well. That's how we overcome our biases, right? Is to hear from people who don't have the same perspectives we do. And so I encourage you to do that as well. So let's talk about what the fuss is about. First of all, I want to talk about what are some things that Scrum and Kanban share in common. One thing, and this is surprising to some people, is that they both come from manufacturing. A common objection you hear sometimes is that Kanban was made for manufacturing, but Scrum was made for software. But actually, the first Scrum paper is about how to make better photocopiers. They both do ultimately come from manufacturing, although I will say that Scrum adapted to the software space far, far earlier and more quickly than Kanban has. Both restrict the amount of work in process, although they do this in very different ways. We'll talk about that. Both allow you to add your own helpful stuff. You know, Scrum even comes right out of the gate saying that it's purposefully incomplete. And that's a selling point, because if there are particular ways that you like to do things that are consistent with the principles of Scrum, but don't violate any of the things mandated in it, you can kind of do whatever you want. And Kanban is very similar in that way. Both facilitate incremental delivery. So whichever one you're using, you are still delivering the software in increments, which allows you the fast feedback. So at the core of the kinds of practices that make us more agile, both Scrum and Kanban can get you there. Neither mandate specific engineering practices like TDD or microservices or particular architectural styles. That's up to you. And both incorporate an overlapping progressive application of each part of the software life. Man, I messed that acronym up, right? Software development lifecycle is what I meant to say. SLDC sounds like some secret government agency. But they both do this rather than you do all the requirements and then you do all the coding and you do all the testing. Both of them are using that iterative overlapping progression of those phases as you go. And so one thing I really want people to come away with is that both Scrum and Kanban have overall mechanisms that can increase agility. It's not that one is agile and one isn't. They both have the underlying mechanisms that can increase your agility. You can actually have success with either. It's not a matter of one being awesome and one being terrible. So let's start looking at some of the things that each of these ideas require. So Scrum has some requirements, Kanban has some requirements. So when we look at the things that Scrum mandates, one of the things it mandates is a specific set of values. And you all are very familiar with Scrum. You probably talk about these values a lot. I hope you do. It also requires certain roles, the developers, product owner, and Scrum Master, and there's some criteria around those roles, or responsibilities rather. It has certain events, right? The sprint planning, the daily Scrum, we're all familiar with these. Sometimes it tells you how long they need to be, sometimes it doesn't, but you gotta have the events. And then it has the 3 artifacts. Again, this is a Scrum crowd, so you are probably very familiar with all these things. If you see something on this list that doesn't look familiar, feel free to check out the Scrum guide, or we can talk about it later. But here's what Scrum, some of the things that Scrum doesn't mandate. It doesn't mandate a specific event structure. Sometimes it might specify a time limit, but it doesn't tell you specifically how to do sprint planning or what your daily stand-ups have to look like. That's up to you to figure out. It does not mandate an estimation or a forecast method. Now, for this crowd, this is probably old news, but for a lot of people I talk to, even people who have been in Scrum for a while, they are often shocked to find that there is not a specific estimation and forecast method in Scrum. They think it's story points and velocity. And while that is a popular thing for Scrum teams to do, that is not actually in the Scrum guide anywhere. It doesn't recommend a specific method for that. You get to pick the method that works best for you. It doesn't mandate sprint commitments. It kind of used to. If you know, I've been in Scrum for a long time. And in the beginning, that was kind of a big thing, that you take your sprint backlog and you commit to the delivery. But now Scrum has evolved. You commit to the sprint goal, but you don't commit to specific backlog content. So that backlog can be renegotiated as long as the sprint goal is not put in jeopardy. And it doesn't mandate any workflow management besides the sprint, right? So you have the sprint, you have the events around the sprint, but it doesn't mandate exactly how you attack the work items that are included in that sprint. You can do them all at once. You can do them one at a time. You can swarm around them. You can have individuals work on them. You can do the back end of all of them and then do the front end for all of them. You can arrange that workflow pretty much however you want. Scrum does not require you to do that in a specific way. I think there are some ways that are better than others, but Scrum lets you pick what's going to work best for you. Well, when we look at what Kanban requires, it's almost the polar opposite. Kanban requires a definition of your workflow. So it wants you to define what constitutes a work item. For us, it's usually user stories. For other shops, it might be different. It wants you to define the starting and stopping point of your workflow. When does the clock start and when does it stop when it comes to a feature? Very similar to definition of done in a lot of ways. What are the stages that your work moves through, the work in progress stages? Is it just to do, doing, and done? Is it, requirements, code, test, deploy? What are your stages? It requires you to define how you're going to control work in progress. It requires you to define your explicit policies on how the team is going to work together. What meetings are you going to have? How do you know which thing to do next? And it also requires a service level expectation. In other words, it requires you to publish when people can expect things to be done. So those are things that Kanban requires. It's very workflow centric. It also requires you to visualize the definition of the workflow. It doesn't require you to visualize it in a specific way, but you do have to have some visual representation of your definition of workflow. It requires continuous improvement, and it requires you to keep certain flow metrics. And I did not list those out there. I didn't know how much interest there was in that. Again, this isn't so much to sell you on Kanban as it is to highlight some of the differences and commonalities between Scrum and Kanban. But I love talking about flow metrics. And if there's a lot of interest after this, I would be more than happy to go in and even show you what we do in our shop for flow metrics. Kanban does not mandate any kind of roles, any kind of meetings, any kind of estimation or forecast methods, any policies. It does not mandate that you have a board, which is sometimes a surprise for people. The board is kind of the iconic piece of Kanban, right? But actually, it's not mandated. A visualization is mandated, but you can visualize it however you want. I've worked with organizations before, and we designed their visualization to look like a target, where items moved into the bullseye, or some of them have looked kind of like a chutes and ladders game. So it doesn't have to be a Kanban board. That's just the most common. And Kanban does not mandate any values. We are all a bunch of unprincipled, amoral jerks in Kanban. We don't, there's no specific values that you have to have. I hope you do have values. I'm a big fan of values, but Kanban does not list for you the values that you need to have. So looking at those lists of kind of what Scrum is concerned about and what Kanban is concerned about, there's certain generalizations we can draw from this. And I'm painting with a very broad brush here. We could take issue with almost any of these bullet points. So I'm just speaking in very general, very broad terms that cover most teams. Your specific situation might be different from this. But a lot of times Scrum focuses on structuring the team and its interactions. It's about the events, the responsibilities. It's a lot about the team and the way they interact with each other. And it gives you a fair amount of information on what these things need to look like. Who attends these events? What are the deliverables? In many cases, how long can they be? What do the different responsibilities entail? What do each of the events entail? And when teams have to figure stuff out with Scrum, a lot of it is more about the product. What goes into the product? What are the features we're going to include? We don't have to figure a lot about our working policies because Scrum gives us a lot of those, or at least it gives us a foundation for most of them. Kanban, on the other hand, focuses on structuring the workflow. It says almost nothing about team structure and team interactions. It specifies the areas that you need to manage, but it leaves the how up to you. For example, Kanban says you need to have a policy on controlling work in process, but it doesn't tell you what that policy should be. It doesn't tell you how to control work in process. It just says you need to. So it's more of a list of make sure you're taking care of these things, but it doesn't tell you what that looks like. There's kind of a myth going around that Scrum is better for beginning teams and Kanban is better for mature teams. And I don't think that's true on either side of that fence. But I think this is where that myth comes from, because there's a lot of team policies that under Kanban you have to figure out, whereas Scrum is kind of more inclined to tell you, how you should do certain things. So with Kanban, most of the stuff to figure out is how the team wants to work together. We have to figure out, what are we going to do about blocked items? What meetings are we going to have? What are we going to do at those meetings? Who's going to come to those meetings? What are the deliverables? We have to figure out all that stuff. We're figuring out team policies, the kinds of things, if you've ever done a team charter, that fits Kanban super well, because those are the kinds of things that Kanban wants you to figure out. Kanban also has better looking practitioners. Now, I understand that is a little subjective, but I'm kind of partial to that bullet point personally. But again, you can decide what you agree with and what you don't. Let's talk about how these two ways of thinking limit work in progress, because they both do it, but they do it in very different ways. So the way Scrum does it is every sprint has a goal. And then the team, every sprint during sprint planning, selects the amount of work that they believe they can complete in the sprint that will achieve the goal. You can pull new work in if you want, but only if it doesn't risk the goal. And in order to make this decision, it usually requires some degree of sizing or estimation. Even if it's just people's gut feel, you usually have to have some conversation based on the length of your sprint, what you think is going to be achievable, right? And so a lot of times I tell people sprint goal plus sprint length equals the WIP limits in Scrum. That's how it makes sure you're not doing too much at any given time. The goal and the length of the sprint work together to kind of constrain how much work you can take on at once. Kanban, on the other hand, declares by fiat how many items can be in progress at any given time. You just say, yeah, we can only effectively have 10 things in progress at once, or we can only effectively have 5 things in progress at once. Some Kanban teams will do this on a stage by stage basis. So we can only have a certain amount of items in coding. We can only have a certain amount of items in testing. Other Kanban teams will set the limit for the entire system, the entire life cycle. Like I'm not going to limit how many items can be in which stage, but I am going to limit how many things we've got going on all at once. And items are continuously being pulled in at a rate that matches the completion rate. So the idea is with Kanban, things are moving in and out at a continuous flow. There's no specific time box, but the amount of items that you're working on at any given time is constrained. You can only have, if I've got a team of 6, maybe our WIP limit is 3. So even though we never have a time box, we can only ever have 3 items at once. And then when something gets done, we now have capacity and we can pull another item in. Sizing and estimation tend to be less relevant in Kanban. It has been years since I have done any sizing or estimating activity on our user stories. The system just works fine without it. But depending on conversations and context, sometimes teams still need to do that. We use projections and forecasts to help clients predict the future, and we can talk about that in a minute as well. But generally speaking, these are the basic strategies for limiting WIP, and you can see how they're different.
And when you refer to sizing and estimating, Phil, were you referring to the Kanban, on Kanban, or are you referring to both Scrum and Kanban? Because I know that with Scrum, there's always estimation that needs to be done prior to.
That's right. That's right. So you can see there on the Scrum side, Scrum tends to require sizing and estimating, but Kanban doesn't really. So that's one of the key differences between them.
Right.
Now, some Kanban teams still do it. It's helpful to them, or their context requires it for some reason, but it's the system works without sizing and estimating on the Kanban side, but on the Scrum side, you got to do it to some extent, pretty much.
Right.
Yeah. Excellent question. So how do we do forecasting? So on the Scrum side, it requires forecasting for each sprint, but it doesn't tell you how. You get to pick. Oftentimes people will use story points. However, that's not mandated by Scrum. There is no mention of story points in the Scrum guide. The use of team velocity is also common, although again, that's not in the Scrum guide. That's a decision. And a lot of people are unaware about that. I'm a certified Scrum Master, and I was taught story points and velocity, and I did not know that was not actually a requirement of Scrum. But it isn't. The Scrum guide is a lot more flexible than a lot of people give it credit for. And if story points and velocity work for you, then great, stick with it. But it does free you up to pick strategies that may fit your team better. Kanban requires an SLE. In other words, when I have a Kanban system, I always want everybody to know what the probabilities are for how long things take. So an example SLE for a team might be 85% of the time, an item will be completed in 13 days or less. So I've got the probability there, 85% of the time. I've got the cycle time on there, the 13 days or less, and that constitutes an SLE. It's a service level expectation. It's not an agreement, it's an expectation. The point isn't that that I'm committing to getting everything done in 13 days or less. It's an expectation. It lets people know what they can expect out of our Kanban system. Throughput data is used to project completion rates of work items. So what we do is we look at how often do we complete things, how long does it take to do that, and then we use that data to project out items in the future. The Kanban community is also where Monte Carlo simulations really became popular. Now this is kind of bigger than Kanban, but this is kind of where it really took off, is using that data to use Monte Carlo simulations to simulate project completion. This is what we do with our clients. And I don't want to spend my whole talk on this, but I do want to tell you this is super cool. And even if you're never going to use Kanban in your life, I really recommend looking into this. I'm going to give you my email address at the end so we can keep talking about this. This is such a powerful tool. And amazingly accurate. So if you've struggled maybe a little bit with forecasting, let me sell you on Monte Carlo simulations at some point. So which is better? This is why we all came here, right? And in a conference called Serious Scrum, I'm really excited about this part. I kind of feel like I'm a fan of the opposing football team. You know, so which is better? So the question I would ask you is, how often does development need to stop so you can figure out what should go into the product? I think this is a key question for every Agile team to ask themselves. How exploratory is our product? How unknown is our product? There's always an element of the unknown with every software development project. Well, with few exceptions. Virtually all of them have some element of the unknown, but some of them more so than others. Right. And so I find that a lot of teams, they were struggling with software development. They knew something needed to change. Scrum is very popular and very accessible. So they adopted Scrum and it did make their lives better, which is awesome. That's what's supposed to happen. But there wasn't a specific time where they sat and thought, is Scrum really the best fit for our situation? And I think this is a very important question. How often does development need to stop so you can figure out what should go into the product? Do you kind of know what's going to go into the product? Or are you in a situation where you're having to take baby steps, see what happens, and then make decisions based on that? I think that's an important question for this, because here's one end of the spectrum. With each product increment, we need to see what happens so we can decide what to do next with the product. So if you're close to this end of the spectrum, or if you're closer to this end of the spectrum, your software projects tend to be very exploratory. You don't have a list of features at the beginning necessarily. You maybe know the first few things you want to get done, but then you're just not going to be sure until you see what the market reaction is going to be, or various things. If you're having to explore your product as you go and figure it out as you go, the more you look like that, the more valuable Scrum is, because Scrum was designed for that specific thing. It was designed for complex, adaptive solutions. It was designed for innovation. It was designed for highly competitive environments. The very first Scrum paper is about photocopiers and cameras. How do we compete in a market flooded with photocopiers? How do we compete in a market flooded with cameras? So the closer you are to that, the more valuable Scrum is. Again, not to say it's not valuable in other circumstances. Don't hear me wrong. I'm not saying if this isn't you, drop Scrum. I'm just saying that the closer you are to this, the more valuable Scrum will be. The further away from it you are, the less valuable Scrum becomes. So here are some common scenarios where Scrum is super valuable. You're trying to make a new disruptive product in the market, or you're a product in a market with heavy competition. Maybe you're building a product that's totally different than anything you've ever attempted to build before. Anytime that you are highly uncertain about the direction the product needs to take, or if it's even worth doing. If you're like, hey, let's get a few increments out the door and see if people are interested in buying this, and if not, we're gonna quit. Scrum is great for stuff like that. I do have to say, in fairness, there are other ways to tackle this. Tameflow, which I'm a big fan of, has a move. Lean Startup has MVPs, and you can use these with Scrum as well. But Scrum is really, really great for those scenarios where you're having to build out a little bit and then kind of figure out where you go from there. That's really what Scrum was primarily built for, and the scenarios in which it is just brilliant. But what if you're on the other end of the spectrum? What if you're on the end of the spectrum where you have a pretty decent idea of what's going into the software, and it's probably going to change somewhat, but it's not like you're going to totally pivot on the project or totally kill the project. So here's an example. We have a backlog of user stories ready to go that we can pull from every sprint. So you've already got a backlog, you've already got stories that are fairly easy to refine, or they're already very well refined. You know, you're doing sprint review on Friday, you're doing sprint planning on Monday, and you're just pulling in stories that you've already got ready to go. If you're in a scenario like that, you might really want to take a look at Kanban, because you might be pretty close to continuous flow. And you might be putting up a time box where maybe a time box isn't giving you the value that you might want. And maybe that time box nature of Scrum is just not as important. Again, I'm not trying to make the decision for you. I'm not saying, you know, if you've got a backlog of user stories, you should stop doing Scrum and start doing Kanban. That is not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that when you're in a situation where you don't have to continually kind of reinvent the product, kind of figure it out as you go, then the sprint nature of Scrum becomes less useful. Not useful, but less useful. And you might start looking at something that is more oriented toward continuous flow. Again, I am going to end this talk with ways that we can use them together. So please don't kick me off the Zoom yet. So here are some Kanban scenarios. If you're doing new line of business software for internal use, this is the bulk of what my company ends up doing, by the way. So it explains why we use Kanban so much. Most of the software we build is for clients who use it for internal use for line of business stuff. And when you're building line of business software, yeah, there's definitely unknowns for sure. And you're definitely going to respond to user feedback for sure. But you're probably not going to substantially change the nature of the software. So we're not really having to like figure out brand new feature sets as we go. If you're doing the next phase of development on an established product, right? So you're adding features to a product that's already pretty well known and pretty well established. You're not trying to like figure out, you know, brave new worlds. A product that has some high level similarities to products you've built before. Again, every software project is different. I really resist the idea that software development is something that you can know super well in advance. There is no software project like that. There's always stuff you have to learn, always stuff you have to figure out. Your backlog is always going to be negotiated every single project. But there's a difference between here's a product and we really don't know what we're going to end up with, and a product where, yeah, I mean, you know, 70% of what we got here is probably going to end up in the product. And, you know, we're pretty familiar with the technology. We're pretty familiar with the business. It's gonna change for sure, but it's not going to be that different. Kanban is really good for those. Whenever you are relatively certain that the product is going to be built and what will need to go into it. So that's kind of like the opposite end of the spectrum. The closer you are to this, the more valuable Kanban becomes. So then the question is, well, do I have to do one or the other, right? Because I like some of the things you said about Kanban, but I also really like some of the things about Scrum. Do I really have to come down in one camp or the other? Well, the answer to that is you don't necessarily have to choose one or the other, But at the same time, you can't just randomly decide to do both and randomly mix and match pieces either. That does not work well. So we're going to kind of talk about that aspect of it. So here's a scenario. Can we use Scrum for our highly exploratory projects and Kanban for our well-defined projects? Yes, of course. We have a client that's exactly like this. They are a design firm. They do a lot of UI, UX work. In some of their projects, all of their projects have some exploratory work, but some of them, it's relatively well-defined. Others, they have no idea. They're just starting from ground zero. Client has no idea what they want. We don't know how users are going to respond at all. We're going to be figuring out these features as we go. So they use Scrum for some and Kanban for some. Can we use Scrum at the beginning and then switch to Kanban as the product's feature list becomes clearer? Yes, this is a very, very common thing for teams to do. Some of you may have heard that teams will start in Scrum and then switch to Kanban over time. Now, sometimes this happens for very bad reasons. Sometimes, Scrum, like any agile framework, is challenging. People are challenged by it. It's painful. And they're like, well, I don't want to do Scrum anymore. Let's do Kanban because then we can do whatever we want. And then they are unpleasantly surprised to find that Kanban still requires you to do things like be iterative and control your work in progress and collaborate and things like that. But sometimes teams switch because at the beginning, things are very uncertain. But as time goes on, things kind of stabilize a little bit. And then they're like, well, now the exploratory nature of the time box, like we needed it in the beginning, but now we really don't. Now work just kind of flows. We just kind of do whatever comes next. So yeah, starting with Scrum when things are very in the air and moving to Kanban as things become more well-known, this happens all the time. Can we use Scrum to plan the product increments and then use Kanban to manage the workflow within the sprint? So something you've probably noticed by now is that Scrum is very product oriented, right? Like how do we innovate around this product? And Kanban is very workflow oriented. Like how do we get work done as efficiently as we can? So is it possible to use Scrum for product planning? And so we sort of plan our sprints and increments and content of those sprints using Scrum, but the work that we do within a sprint, can we use Kanban to manage it? Absolutely, absolutely. And you can even keep flow metrics and everything. There are even courses that are now springing up about this, how to use Kanban's workflow tools within the confines of a larger Scrum framework. You can absolutely do that. Here's the thing though. Can we do Scrum but use the parts about Kanban we like, such as WIP limits and flow metrics? You really have to be careful here. And this is where I think a lot of teams that try to combine the approaches kind of go wrong. Scrum and Kanban are different. They are not the same. And they have two different strategies of looking at work and the way work is going to flow. Scrum has on purpose a start-stop model where you plan these short bursts of delivery. And the reason that it's staggered that way is because Scrum assumes that you're going to need time to think about what's coming next in the product. You don't know that in advance. So I want to get an increment out the door. I want to see how the market responds, for example. And then on the basis of what people like or don't like, I'm going to plan my next increment based on what I saw. Right? Oh, everybody hates that feature. Okay, well, let's not put more money into that. Let's focus on a different set of features. Or, wow, nobody seems to like this product at all. Let's kill it and start a new product. Scrum time boxes are designed for that dynamic to be a part of it, right? Kanban assumes that work is happening in a continuous flow. And you're still going to talk about the product. You're still going to plan. That does not go away in Kanban. You're still going to periodically evaluate. That all is still going to happen. But everything about Kanban assumes that you aren't pausing, that work is coming in and going out at a reasonably continuous rate, not we're starting a time increment, doing a set chunk of work, and then stopping that set chunk of work. So when I run into teams that try to put these together, this is where they have a lot of trouble. Their metrics look crazy because the structures of Kanban are designed to work with continuous flow. The structures of Scrum are designed to work around that. Let's plan, let's build, let's stop. let's think, let's plan again, let's build, let's stop, let's think. And some of those structures work okay together, but some of them just don't. They're just two very different paradigms. So I would highly recommend just not piecemeal pulling stuff in that you like from both systems, but having an actual conversation, having an actual thought about what you're hoping to get out of those pieces and how they're going to work together. Okay, well, can we still do Kanban and still have daily stand-ups and regular retrospectives and reviews? You absolutely can. Remember that Kanban does not mandate any roles and responsibilities. It doesn't mandate any events. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have them. It means that you define them. So I've seen Kanban teams look very much like Scrum teams. They have a 2-week demo and review. They have a retrospective every 2 or 3 weeks. They have daily scrums, daily stand-ups every single day. And if you were just to watch them on a day-to-day basis or look at their calendar, you might not even realize that they weren't doing Scrum. The point about Kanban is you can do whatever you want. You get to have the roles that fit you, the events that fit you, and the cadences that fit you. There's just not a predetermined thing to hang those on. So if you're thinking, well, I liked what I heard about Kanban, but there's really some things about Scrum that I like I love that daily stand-up, it's really valuable, or I don't know what we would do without our retrospectives. First of all, good for you. But secondly, you can still have them. Every Kanban team that I run, we have daily stand-ups, we have regular retrospectives, we have regular demos and reviews with the stakeholders on cadences, just like a Scrum team would. So, you know, you can absolutely do those things. All right, that is pretty much what I got. This is a slide that just has my contact information. I love talking about this stuff. So there's my email address. Feel free to email me directly. The website is my company. We also just started a podcast. So that's why it's not on this slide. It's called Agile Bites. And it's on Apple Podcasts, it's on Spotify, it's on Anchor, it's on Google Podcasts. I don't have that on here because I didn't add it to this slide. And then my LinkedIn as well. I'm very active on LinkedIn. I love connecting with colleagues on LinkedIn. My marketing person says I'm not good at LinkedIn because all my connections are my peers and not clients. But that's what I love. I mean, you guys are my people. You're my friends and my colleagues. And so definitely reach out. You can even leave me a note that you heard my talk, so I'll know where I know you from. And we can keep talking about this stuff.